I've never heard him be so optimistic in my whole life. So we're going to take that for a win, everyone. He tempers my optimism, which is totally appropriate and necessary at times. Okay. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Amit Rakhit. He's somewhere here. Here he comes. I don't think he needs much of an introduction. He joined the Angelman community, I think, 4 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. I remember, over a coffee in Manhattan. And we have had a wonderful relationship ever since. Amit has become the president of Ovid Therapeutics, and that's pretty incredible, so we should give you a round of applause for that. And he is going to talk to us about paving the way for Angelman syndrome and their work with the STARS and now NEPTUNE trial. So let's hear it for Amit Rakhit.
Great. Thanks, Allison. Well, thanks, everybody. Yes, as Allison mentioned, this is my 4th time here, so many familiar faces and a lot of new faces as well. So really, really ecstatic to be here, especially seeing all the new therapies that are coming on board and potentially for the future. I think that's a great place to be for us as we think about therapeutic options for treating Angelman syndrome and then also one day making it history. So this forward-looking statements, because we're a public company, just so you can see those. So I think when I looked back up how many people were here about 3 years ago, it was about 600, and I think this is fairly accurate from what when we asked the FAST team. And then how many people are here today? It's growing. It's almost like 900 plus people. And then when we thought about how many therapies were in development about 5 years ago, there really weren't that many that were in clinical stage. There was actually none in clinical stage. And now, how many are we looking at today? And I think this number is a little inaccurate because there's more than 5, as Allison showed you a little bit earlier. But it's an exciting place to be as we look at the evolving science, as about looking at the evolving therapies that will make meaningful differences for you, your families, and your loved ones. So if you think back, and I looked at when my time in the industry has been about 20 years or so. If you look back 25 years ago in the multiple sclerosis space, there were no therapies available for multiple sclerosis. Today, this is 25 years later, there's more than 20 approved therapies for MS, and that's amazing. If you look at spinal muscular atrophy that we just heard about, there were no therapies either, just only about 3 years ago. And now there's 2, potentially 3 coming on that are approved today. So it's an amazing place to be, and I think you can see that the engine's running, and hopefully we can see new progress with Angelman syndrome as well. So for us, OV101, as you know, we've been working with the community over time, looking at both our initial studies, our phase 2 study, which was the STARS program, and now we have our phase 3 program, which is a pivotal registrational study for Angelman syndrome called the NEPTUNE trial. So pivotal registrational study, what does that mean? It's kind of on the path, depending on the data, for registration with a regulatory authority. And so in the US, that would be the FDA. In Europe, it's EMA, and then there's other regulatory authorities around the world. But it's really the beginning, right? So we look at this as the doorstep because there's so many interesting new therapies coming on board, as you saw earlier. So, but this wasn't the story not too long ago, and it's really just the beginning. So sometimes in the past, drug discovery was only just beginning, and we're looking at this space. The resources weren't there, and Angelman syndrome was relatively unknown beyond the community here. And I think that's changing, which is all good for the better. So at Ovid, as you know, we've been founded really to focus on rare neurology conditions, and by engaging you and the families here and the clinicians and the scientists have really helped us lead us to where we are today. With our lead OV101 compound is our focus, and has always been the initial focus, was Angelman syndrome. And that's our first program that we've had at Ovid, and we're very, very happy to say that it's moving forward thanks to all the work that's been done here as well as externally with our investigators. Well, what is OV101 or gaboxidol? So this is a downstream, so it's not gene therapy, but it's not all the way at the symptom. I would say it's in the middle. It's a symptomatic that tries to address one of the changes that happen when the UBE3A gene is lost. And there's with the loss of the UBE3A gene, there's a deficiency of one of the compounds in the brain that's responsible for communication and communication between neurons. And there's two main ones in the brain that happen, is the GABA system and the glutamate system. And you can think of GABA as kind of inhibiting and kind of dampening down signals, while the glutamate activity kind of excites signals. And there's a balance that has to happen between the GABA and glutamate systems. This is called tonic inhibition. And this is the ability to distinguish signal from noise. And if there's an imbalance there, sometimes what happens is that the brain becomes inundated with signals and it's very difficult to interpret what's going on, which could lead to symptoms down the road, whether it could be behavioral, it could be motor dysfunction, like, for example, an unsteady gait. It could be communication. It could be sleep. And those are some of the areas that we're focused on with OV101 or urgoboxidol to really restore the deficiency of GABA. And so what this compound does is actually an agonist. So it actually acts at the receptor that GABA would if GABA was available. And in Angelman syndrome, because GABA is deficient, the OV101 acts as a sort of replacement for this at the receptor. And we've seen this in mouse models, which really propelled us into our clinical phase 1 studies. And in those mouse models of Angelman syndrome, it appeared that OV101 restored tonic inhibition and corrected motor activity, especially the gait and balance, as well as improved areas around behavior, cognition, and memory. So moving forward, and I'm not going to spend too much time on the STARS clinical program, but the STARS clinical program is not moving for me. Oh, there you go. Thank you. So it was the phase 2 program with OV101, and this is the study that we described last year with the results coming out. This was the first industry-sponsored clinical trial in Angelman syndrome. And what we saw here is, I'm going to go back a slide, I think. Whoops. Could you go back a slide for me, too? Because I think this computer is acting up for me a little bit. And one more. Can you get me to the slide right here?
This advancer.
Let's see, it's like thinking.
You want this
Oh,
one?
there we go, that's perfect. Thank you.
That's what you want?
Yep. Okay. Great. So the STARS clinical trial was our first it was the first industry-sponsored clinical study. It was an international randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study, and this was in ages 13 to 49. And there were 88 people who were in this trial, and we looked at safety, tolerability, as well as exploratory measures on efficacy. This program was part of the American Academy of Neurology's Top Science program earlier this year, with the results. Primarily was chosen among a couple others, not many were chosen in the Top Science, because of the advances that Angelman syndrome, of the treatments of Angelman syndrome over the many years that it's been there, and because this is the first study that actually happened with Angelman syndrome in the kind of clinical investigation setting from an industry sponsor. What we saw here was that the efficacy endpoint that we looked at was something called the CGI-I, the Clinical Global Impressions of Improvement. And as we heard earlier today from Dr. Kakis about looking at the heterogeneity of Angelman syndrome, it's difficult to assess a specific domain when you have multiple domains or multiple symptoms happening. And so looking at a global assessment in entirety, looking at the individual as a whole is very important. And this is one thing that this assessment does, is it allows you and the clinician to really think about the individual in entirety. So it looks at, for our purposes, the areas of sleep, behavior, motor function, communications, and assesses over time what that looks like from baseline to the end of the study. And in this program, the STARS phase 2 study, we found a statistically significant, which is important for us when we think about clinical trials, of what's really happening by chance versus what's actually potentially a real signal in the once-a-day arm of OV101. So that led us to having further conversations with the FDA, with the EMA, and really designing our NEPTUNE study, which is our phase 3 program. So the phase 3 program also is randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled. I mean, there's an arm that does not have active OV101, and it's 12 weeks in duration in pediatric population. So this age group is 4 to 12 years old. So the primary endpoint here is the CGI-I, and it's the CGI-I-AS. Why does it say CGI-I-AS, which is different than the CGI-I in STARS? It's because we've refined how we assessed the CGI-I for Angelman syndrome, specifically giving parameters and very strict guidance on how to assess behavior, how to assess motor function, both fine motor, such as picking up a fork or a pencil, versus walking, which is gross motor, sleep, as well as communications. The details, I'll show you a few examples of what that looks like specifically on the behavior domain. The study started in September. We expect the last enrollments for this program to happen in early 2020, probably look like March, April, would say it would be around the time that we would completely enroll this study, with the data coming out in mid-2020. There are sites in the US, Israel, Australia, Italy, Germany, and Netherlands that are slated to start. Currently, there's 4 sites that are active. That includes, you'll see some of the folks here. I know Dr. Birds is here. So San Diego, Phoenix, Seattle, and outside of Philadelphia, with sites opening in Boston, North Carolina, and Chicago in the next week or two, and then, or next couple of weeks. And then we also have Dr. Heimer's site in Tel Aviv open as well. And so as we look at that, we also mentioned that there's the cohorts of a group that we're looking at as 4 to 12 years old. We started with the 9 to 12-year-old age group as an older age group, and then we had something called an independent data monitoring committee look at the first few patients that have actually enrolled in the study in a blinded, in an independent way. So we don't know exactly what data they've seen, but what they were asked to do was look at first safety and what's going on with the first few subjects that were actually in, first few people in that age cohort, as well as look at the dosing. So if you remember, the dosing in our adult study for STARS was 15 milligrams once a day. When you look at pediatrics, those doses have to be adjusted because of weight as well as age. And what we've done is actually done a physiologically based model which extrapolates the adult and adolescent data and backtracks into what the dose should be based on a lower weight, so that a 4-year-old in the study or a 9-year-old in the study who's a lower weight than an adult who might be 25 years old will have a different dose but still have the same effects and levels of the drug in their system, kind of backtracked according to weight. So the other thing that the DMC or the Data Monitoring Committee was looking at was not only just safety assessments, but if the model that we've created is holding for the doses in that age group so that we can move into the younger age groups. So they just met this week, and so the DMC opened the trial for the 4 to 8-year-olds. So currently, all age groups are being enrolled in this study from 4 to 12. Other pieces around this NEPTUNE study is that you have to have a genetic diagnosis of Angelman syndrome. As I mentioned, the ages are 4 to 12. There is a small group, 5 people that will look to enroll 2 to 3-year-old age group just for safety assessments. There's a severity scale. You can see that there's an age and weight requirements. That's mostly due to the way we've actually provided the study drug, because it's active drug as well as placebo. And the way it's packaged, just because for efficiency and effectiveness, there's the weight bands because there are multiple combinations. They come in a blister pack, so you just basically open day one, and it automatically either titrates up and puts you on the dose that you're supposed to be on, but in a blister pack. There's some key exclusion criteria, primarily as poorly controlled seizures, or if you're not on stable medications for the 4 weeks prior to the study. And then we do have an actigraphy, which is measuring sleep. So part of the study is not just looking at the CGI-I, but is looking to see why the CGI-I might be changing. And the secondary endpoints in this study include measurements of sleep independently, measured by the actigraphy. For those of you who participated in STARS, that was a watch that you wore, the ActiveWatch 2. We've looked at, there's a newer generation of watches that are out there, and we've actually explored several. So the current actigraphy is a bit easier, we hear, to wear, and people are able to wear it more fully for longer. We haven't had many, let's say, people who have not been able to tolerate wearing the new actigraphy. It kind of clips on to your sock or your hip, and really, really unobtrusive. And then there's a scale also that we're using called the Vineland scale, which is another way of looking at domains of behavior, motor function, and communications. So this is the study design. There's a screening period of up to 28 days. You may actually be able to screen into the study within 8 days if you actually can wear the watch or the actigraphy device and can tolerate it. And actually, we've had several folks who have entered into the study not having to go through the entire 28-day period. And then after that, there is a randomization. So you either get randomized blinded, so we don't know what treatment option you'll get, but it's either once a day dosing of actual OV101 versus once a day dosing of placebo or non-active non-active drug. The treatment duration is 12 weeks, and then there's a 2-week observation period after the study is completed. So it's a total of about 18-week study in the study program. So all patients who complete NEPTUNE, all patients who've actually completed the STARS study are eligible to roll into the open label extension called ELARA. The ELARA study is currently recruiting as well. The majority of people from STARS have rolled into this program, which is open label extension. Anybody completing the NEPTUNE study will also be able to roll in to the ELARA protocol. This is a 3-year-long open label extension study. The visits are spaced out, and we also look at efficacy measures like the CGI-I in the ELARA program as well to look at long-term effects of OV101. So ELARA is all open label. Everybody gets OV101. There's no placebo in the ELARA arm. Also with ELARA, for those of you, and there are some I know here, families who have more than one child with Angelman syndrome and have wanted to participate in NEPTUNE, but are not sure which of their children they would like to participate. Our protocol for NEPTUNE says that the oldest child can participate in the study unless there is a discussion with the clinician. But if there is a choice to be made, the oldest child can participate in the NEPTUNE study. However, upon completion of the NEPTUNE study, all siblings who have Angelman syndrome can then join into the ELARA protocol as well for all open label OV101. So that also is part of that OV101 ELARA program. Just thinking. The slides are a little graphic heavy, so it might, there we go. So the CGI-I, as I mentioned, is the endpoint, looking at overall improvement or change in function and global function after the individual has started therapy after 12 weeks. And then there's very specific guidance provided on how we actually score and ask you questions about how to look at the CGI-I. Because the CGI-I is an improvement scale, you have to have a baseline assessment to start with, and the baseline is what we call the severity, the CGI-S. And here's an example of the CGI-S, which is looking at the behavior domain. And so if you look at CGI-S, there are very specific guidance on what's a score of a 2 or a 3 or a 4 or a 5 or a 6 or a 7. This is done for all the domains, and it's very consistent across sites. So we've trained, and we have fairly good training material, as well as kind of case studies and vignettes that all our investigators who are participating in the trial have completed. We see that there's very good correlation between different sites, so that there's not much variability in how people are assessing. And so this is something we want to do because this actually ensures that the trial can be as robust as possible. This is just one example. The overall CGI-I-AS and CGI-S-AS is currently being prepared into a manuscript. So we have intention of actually sharing this with the community so that we can publish this. Many of the authors, some of them are here, are working on pulling together what the methodology was and how we've actually pulled that together, and then to come up with a scale that was actually accepted by the FDA as a primary endpoint measure, as well as within the EMA as well. So we wanted to actually be able to share that. We're in a manuscript that's being submitted soon, and also we've submitted several abstracts to one of the congresses that are coming up, which is a scientific meeting called the American Academy of Neurology, which would hopefully, we'll hear that they'll get accepted to be presented when that meeting happens in the spring of next year. So what does it mean, I think, for the changes, what these changes are looking like? When you see an improvement scale, these are some of the quotes that have been provided by physicians, clinicians, and observations by parents who participated in the STARS program. So you can take a look at these. And much of these relate around either sleep, independence, behavior. So we're very excited to see what this means for individuals as they complete the NEPTUNE study. And so we do rely on you as caregivers to really give us and give us a sense of what's really happening at home, because this really informs what this potentially has for the symptoms of Angelman syndrome. And so, as you know, this is like a traditional way of looking at discovery, going to research, clinical research, or regulatory review, and afterwards. But there's ways to think about these conditions that don't have any approved therapies and how we can actually work together to get novel treatments sooner in through the process. And I think I'm sorry I'm forgetting a few people here, but I just want to be just so thankful for the community here, but also the scientists and the companies that are working in this space. Many people move around. I have friends probably I do have friends in every one of these companies here. And I think working together to really make a difference for people with rare conditions, with Angelman syndrome, and other things down the road. So I really appreciate your time, and thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers for this opportunity, and we look forward to next steps with you guys.
So my understanding is the CGI-AS is a tool that's going to be published that could potentially be utilized in measurement with other studies. And this is kind of a three-part question. If I participate have my child participate, do I see those results from the CGI-AS and the actigraph? Are you going to publish results of those tools to the trials that you've already done as a whole? And yeah, those are my questions.
Yeah, so great question. So in terms of publishing data that we already have in hand, which is the STARS data, so we do have actigraphy data for the STARS program that we're actually looking at kind of. So the interesting with STARS was that many people weren't able to tolerate the watch very well. Mostly we hear because of sensory issues, and about almost close to 50% of people in STARS weren't able to really tolerate the watch. So that's why we looked at a lot of different options, which would be easier to wear. So the data is there. We're actually working with our steering committee, who are the clinicians, in trying to publish much of this information, not only from the STARS actigraphy, but also our baseline placebo information, so that we do have a nice kind of data package of people who participated who weren't on active drug, but we have like 88. We have 40 some, half of them, right? So about a third of them, of people who went for 12 weeks with a lot of different assessments that we did. So we are looking at how to publish that and kind of working and asking the scientists and clinician community to come forward with ideas so that we can dive into that database that we have. Do you see the data? So we don't, so it's difficult for us as the company to give individual data, so that, because it's all pooled together, and that protects privacy, and there's compliance kind of HIPAA rules. Your clinician, who you go to, can have access to the people that they actually saw in their clinics, and then that would be a discussion with you and the investigator. So we don't do it as a company, because that's all blinded to us. We don't know who's on which arm. We just, it's blinded in terms of what we receive are basically ID numbers, but the clinicians and the investigators who are participated know who those are. So they'd be able to provide that.
Hi, Amit. If the OV101 is successful in the sense that it provides some improvements for some people and gets approved by the FDA, what is the timeline you would think for making sort of incremental improvements to this drug to make it more effective for more people over the next however many years?
Yeah, so I think, so our phase 3 NEPTUNE study is looking at CGI-I as a primary endpoint. Now, if that looks, it depends on how strongly the change is that we see. That helps determine how quickly you can get through a package for regulatory approval. So we're hoping to see that we do see a difference between the once a day versus the placebo arm. And then we're looking at a 4 to 12-year-old age group. Right? So I think in terms of, it really depends on what the data looks like and the strength of the data. I think if you look back at the phase 2 STARS study, it was fairly powerful in the once a day arm from a statistical sense. Now remember, this isn't gene therapy, this isn't one of the molecular therapies, it's a little bit more downstream, and so we are looking at all the symptoms that potentially can be affected by tonic inhibition. So we'd want to look at the strength of the data with the CGI-I endpoint, but also what's important is that we want to see movements on and change in sleep, behavior, motor, those specific domains that we're assessing to make sure that what we're seeing is being driven by one of the core symptoms that we're assessing. So it's a little bit of I'll give you a hedged answer, I think, but it really depends on what the data shows.
I have a question over here to your left.
Hey guys, last one, and then we're going to hold it for the panel because we're 5 minutes behind.
What are the most common side effects with the Gebedoxil? Did I pronounce it right?
It's mostly GI. It's like sometimes you have some like stomach upset is the primary one that we see. Some people have said there might be a little bit irritable, but we haven't seen that kind of hold through. It's mostly GI effects.
And Ovid will be here all day, so feel free to ask more questions.
Great. Thank you, everybody.